Thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. As Doug mentioned, I serve as the Nebraska State Climatologist. I'm at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and I sit within the School of Natural Resources. Just some general information. There are a number of agencies that provide climate services in the north central U.S., and those are listed at the top left there. There's various agencies within NOAA. There's USDA climate hubs in the Midwest, as well as Northwest. The American Association of State Climatologists. Most every state in the country does have a state climatologist. We have regional climate centers that are NOAA funded, the Midwestern and the High Plains Regional Climate Centers, as well as the National Drought Mitigation Center. You can access this webinar once it's passed and future webinars at the following websites there on drought.gov, the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and the High Plains Regional Climate Center. As Doug mentioned, we will be open for questions at the end. These webinars are provided on the third Thursday of every month. That's when new and updated monthly and seasonal climate outlooks come out. So that's the reason we're on the third Thursday of every month. My colleague from the West, Dr. Becky Bollinger, will serve as next month's presenter from Colorado State University. So today's webinar, I will recap some 2022 highlights, look at recent conditions, looking at December and January, kind of where we've been in the last 30 to 60 days. We'll look at the latest U.S. Drought Monitor map and some past changes in drought conditions across the region. We'll look at impacts, input received from around the region of the current and emerging of kind of climate issues that are going on right now. And then lastly, take a look in our crystal ball at the climate outlook. So on this image here, you see a picture of the storm that's moving its way through the Central Plains. Some highlights for 2022. Dryness really dominated actually a lot of the region, especially central portions of this north central part of the U.S. On the right, we have the statewide average precipitation rankings for the January through December period. So for the year to date, Nebraska ranked 4th driest on record. There was a dry pocket, as you can see, across the central portion of the region, but not all areas were dry. North Dakota was on the wet side of normal. On the left image of the slide there, you can see there were some pockets of wetness and dryness. So dryness didn't necessarily dominate the entire region over the course of the year. In terms of temperatures, so I've got several images here. On the far right, we have statewide average temperature rankings. Again, for the state as a whole for the entire year, you can see for South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and states to the west, they were in the warmer than normal category. The eastern portion of the region, so including North Dakota, Minnesota, and some states to the east, they were near average, in fact, and that's for the year as a whole. So that's going to wash out a lot of those shorter term and high impact events. One thing I did want to point out was the high temperatures. Those daily highs were a bit higher than normal. So relative warmth in those daytime highs for western and southern parts of this north central region. So portions of South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, parts of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, those averaged above normal for those daytime high temperatures. If you look on the middle of the image there, the minimum temperature percentile rankings, there wasn't really a whole lot necessarily that stood out. We do have that small pocket of below to much below average for those minimum temperatures, again, for the year as a whole for western portions of Kansas. So just some highlights for how 2022 ranked as a whole. So some of you may have seen this image. So NOAA does come out with these $1 billion weather and climate disasters. So I just wanted to point out a few things for this region. You'll see kind of in the central portion there some severe weather events and hail events in May and later on in the summer. Those did categorize in that billion-dollar disaster category. The image or the little icon there in the far west, the western and central drought and heat wave in 2022. I believe that was several $billion worth of damage there, and certainly still ongoing in portions of the region that I will be talking about. So again, this is updated every year. You can also get a historical perspective. And one thing to note is that if we track these over time, we do see a general increase in these billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, which is not only a function of the hazard themselves, but of course, the vulnerability and exposure of where we're living and building and so forth. All right, I'll recap a little bit about December. It was generally wet and cold for the central and northern portion of the region. So on the left, we've got statewide average temperature rankings for the month of December. So those states that are in blue, so Kansas up to North Dakota and into Montana, for the month of December, that was in the below average category. Other portions of the region, but that if it doesn't have a color, then it's in the near average category. Michigan, that ended December in the above average temperature category. If we look at precipitation there on the right, you can see general trend of wetness. So North Dakota, you see a number of 128. That means going back to the period starting in 1895, up till 2022, that ranked as wettest on record. Minnesota and South Dakota as well, those were in the top few wettest Decembers on record, so lots of snowfall. I'll talk later in the webinar about the snowpack conditions, but you can see a general tendency toward wetter than normal conditions, again, for the month of December. Indiana and Ohio, you see that in a different color category. Those were in the below average category again for the month of December. All right, so I'll take a look at recent conditions, and I'm going to cover a few different time periods here. So year to date, so just since the 1st of January up through yesterday, I wanted to show this map because anything in red there, that is averaging 9 degrees or greater warmer than normal. So a lot of warmth really encompassing much of this north central region, particularly in the east. So into Minnesota and points south all the way into Ohio and Kentucky, much warmer than normal here to start the year off in 2023. We do see a few pockets of cooler than normal conditions. So anything in the green color, they're in portions of southwest Nebraska and northeast Colorado, portions of Wyoming and into northern Montana did see cooler or have seen cooler than normal conditions. So not everywhere we've seen this very significant warmth, but for the eastern portion of this north central region, it has been quite warm within the last few weeks. So I'll step back a little bit further. So here we're going 30 days. So if we compare yesterday to the last time we had one of these webinars in the middle of December, you can see that that warmth has kind of hung on for eastern portions of the region. So from Missouri, kind of up through Illinois, Indiana, into Michigan, the eastern portion of Wisconsin and northeast Minnesota. Those in those colors there, those orange and warmer colors, those are in that warmer than normal category, whereas the central and northern portions of the region, so anywhere in that green color, when you start to see those blues, that's averaging around 5 degrees colder than normal. So again, this is over the last 30 days, we've seen a kind of a west to east gradient and difference in how these temperatures have played out. So cooler than normal in the central and northwest portion of the region and warmer than normal in the east. And then just kind of illustrating this longer term trend that we've had in place. If we go back 60 days, we see kind of a similar pattern here. Again, central portions of the region into North Dakota and Montana. Some of those areas are trending 6 to 8 degrees colder or more. And then portions of the east, if we look areas of Missouri and points to the northeast, those are again in that above normal category. So this is going back 60 days, so about the middle of November, this is how the temperatures have trended thus far. And I'll be talking about some impacts of this relative warmth a little bit later in the webinar. So let's switch over to precipitation. One thing I'm not going to show here is if I were to extend out and show the entire contiguous U.S., we would see that wet signal, of course, impacting California. And what you're seeing throughout kind of the central portion of this region, from Colorado into Nebraska and points eastward, kind of into Minnesota, you see this tendency for above normal precipitation. So those colors in that blue and purple, that is 2 to 4 times normal precipitation over the last 30 days. Now, given this is winter time, winter is a relatively dry time of year for much of the country, especially here in the northern plains. So again, it is our dry time of year, but we are seeing above normal conditions for that swath that's kind of extension of the storm track that is hitting the West Coast. Other portions of the region, you see northern South Dakota into North Dakota and the plains of Montana. That portion has been drier than normal over this 30-day period. And then portions, the southern area of this region here, Kansas into Missouri, Illinois, and points eastward, that's been primarily dry. And I'll go back a little bit further here. You can see a similar kind of pattern and trend. So this general wetness across the central portion, again, of the region, areas of Wyoming, Colorado, central Nebraska, into South Dakota, and then further into Minnesota and western portions of Wisconsin. We have seen above normal precipitation totals, and primarily in the form of snow, over the last 60 days. A dryness trend, the signal is also extending into the 60-day time period if we look at areas of Kansas and then tracking kind of further to the east. All right, so I'll transition to looking at frozen precipitation. So we'll look at plains snowpack first. And I should mention in all of these slides, I tried to put the URL associated with these images. So if you want to go back and look at this webinar, then you can see where these images were obtained. The plains snowpack, we're pretty healthy or hefty, kind of in the north central portion. So kind of the sandhills and central portion of Nebraska up north through especially eastern North Dakota and quite a bit of Minnesota, as well as the northern sections of Wisconsin. We're seeing a pretty good snowpack here. Again, obviously this is something that is going to change from day to day and month to month. If we think about it in terms of a water equivalence, we're sitting at about 2+ inches of water equivalence for eastern South Dakota and eastern North Dakota, approaching 3 to 4 inches of water equivalence in that snowpack thus far this year. We're at about 1 inch or so in Nebraska, with more added with this recent storm that has passed through the area and dumped up to about almost 2 feet of snow, in fact, in central portions of Nebraska. If we look further to the west at high elevation snow, so this is color coded according to basin. anything in those cooler colors is going to be near to above average. So the blue is above average, the green is about average, and turquoise and so forth. So much of the region is in that near to slightly above average category. An exception would be if you are in South and Southeast Colorado, that Arkansas River Basin, that is trending below normal thus far. So the area that I have outlined in that oval, that is snowpack that will eventually melt, obviously, and impact this region. So I'm focusing kind of my comments on that region that you see in that oval. One thing to note, though, it is still early in the snow accumulation season. So as we can watch how this tracks over time. So in future webinars, this will be something that we'll keep an eye out on, and recognizing that we don't hit our maximum until, say, late April and early May for these basins. Looking at Missouri River Basin, the mountain snowpack that is within the Missouri River Basin. At this point in the season, we're tracking right around normal. So the two images that you see here, the total in water equivalents above Fort Peck, and then on the right is Fort Peck to Garrison. So we're looking at kind of a northern and southern portions of that upper Missouri Basin region. In the blue, you see that is this season and how we're tracking so far. So for both of these areas that we're looking at, they're pretty much tracking about normal. And normal is, in this context, it's the 1991 to 2020 average. That's that thicker red curve that is ticking up throughout the year, again, reaching its peak at around mid to late April or so. The green is the minimum, and then the dark blue is the maximum, which occurred in various years. So thus far, we're right about normal. And we'll also take a look at the North and South Platte Basin. So the North Platte seems to be benefiting a bit from the recent storm track and snowfall events that we've had, kind of tracking across the northern plains here. So that's a little bit above average thus far in the season, so 130% of average. The South Platte Basin, we're right about average. So again, note that it is still early in the snow accumulation season, so we'll be keeping close track of how these progress through time. All right, if we take a look at the one index to look at the severity of the winter season as a whole. This particular index, it's available from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center at the URL shown below. It's called the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index, and there's different categories of how severe a winter season is. So the locations where you see a dot, that's where we have some longer term climate information in terms of both temperature as well as precipitation, so we can determine this calculation. So if we kind of focus our attention on the box that I've got outlined here, kind of this north central region, where you see the aqua and the purple colors, those are categorized as severe to extreme winter seasons thus far. So this could be due to precipitation and or temperature based. So it could be driven by one or both of those indicators. Where you see the orange and the red colors, that's where we have a moderate to mild winter season as classified by this index. Looking at stream flows, so this map is updated about every few days. So you can go on the USGS website and look at individual points along rivers or at the basin scale, which is what we're looking at here. We do have frozen conditions, obviously, in the north central portion, so that's why you don't see anything that's categorized there. For the rest of the region, if we look at those colors that are orange and darker red and red, those are low stream flows thus far. So portions of southwest Nebraska, eastern Colorado, into Kansas, and especially southwest Kansas, we certainly see indications of this prolonged dryness that we've had in those areas. So that's really where the most significant drought conditions are currently, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. The green coloration that you see in the map, that's 25 to 75%, which is considered normal. So note that is a fairly large range here, but we do see this evidence of dry conditions in areas with the ongoing and persistent drought conditions. All right, keeping our focus on hydrology, we'll look at both lake levels as well as a presence of lake ice. And so that's the image that you're seeing here on the screen, the estimated maximum thickness of ice. So anything that's in blue is free of ice. So one thing to note is that there's a lack of ice along much of the Great Lakes here. Lake Superior, that's the one that has the most ice coverage there. So near record low ice coverage for the basin as a whole, collectively, we're about 4% ice coverage. The open water does lead to an enhanced potential for lake effect snow if the temperatures are cold enough for snow to fall. The water levels in the Great Lakes, those have trended high for the last several years. The water level at this time of year does generally fall as things ice up. The water levels do fall seasonally. This year, where those lake levels are falling at a rate faster than the seasonal decline, that is helping to bring conditions closer to the long-term average after several years of those higher than normal. Okay, and these are some images that if you joined us in the December webinar, I believe they were mentioned, but I just wanted to reiterate this factor that we are going, we did go into the winter with quite dry soils for especially the south central and central portion of the region. So pretty low moisture content. This is a statewide picture of what percent of the soil moisture in that top 6 inches, so the top soil, what percent statewide is considered the short to very short category, which would be essentially below normal soil moisture conditions. So for Nebraska and South Dakota, you see a number of 89 there. So 89% of the state, according to this calculation, that is in that short to very short category. So we're not in a moisture surplus. We did not enter into the winter season with a wet and moist soil profile for a lot of the region, in fact. Conditions were better. If we look further to the east, say in Wisconsin, you see a number of 19, so only 19% of the state, the topsoil was in that short to very short category. If we look deeper in the soil profile, the subsoils, you can see those numbers are also low as well. Kansas at 82%, Nebraska 88%, South Dakota 84%, and up into Montana 83% of the soils are, that subsoil is considered short to very short. So I wanted to just kind of bring this point home that we're dealing with pretty dry soils out there across much of the region. We had, especially for southern portions, we had very little in the way of fall recharge. The current drought, the map for the U.S. Drought Monitor that just came out this morning. So this is released today and reflective of conditions as of Tuesday, January 17th. We see the south central portion of the region that is in the worst condition with the highest moisture deficits. So a lot of Nebraska, southeastern portions of Wyoming, and areas of Kansas, particularly western and southern Kansas, that is in the D3 or extreme drought category or worse. We do have some D4. So D3 covers about 10% of the region. That does stretch into northwest Iowa. There's a little pocket of D3, as well as into northeast Montana. So we're in that severe drought category. That's anything in that red color is in that extreme category. If we look at the region as a whole, there's 45% that is in a drought category. So that would be moderate drought, D1 or worse. So if we encompass the abnormally dry conditions, that D0 category, which is not technically not a drought category, but abnormal dryness, then we're looking at about 71% of the region. Okay, we'll look at how drought has changed over time. Where have we seen alleviations in drought or improvements in drought? Where have we seen degradation of conditions in drought? Over the last 4 weeks, so if we compare this time last month when the last webinar was given, we've seen general areas of improvement, especially in Colorado, central portions of Nebraska, into southeast South Dakota, eastern North Dakota, portions of Minnesota, and then quite a few areas in the east there, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana. These improvements touched essentially all states in this north central region. So anything in the green, the light green, is a 1 category improvement. So going from a D2 back to a D1 would be an example of a 1 category improvement. And then the darker green color would be a 2 class category improvement over those last 4 weeks. We did have some isolated pockets of degradation. So of a few pockets in Montana, south central Colorado, a little bit of western Kansas, portions of Missouri and into Illinois, as well as portions of Michigan, did see some degradation. So if you are joining us from those areas, then it's not been so rosy. Conditions have gotten worse over time. Now, I did want to compare. What's interesting, I think, is looking at changes over the last 6 months. So this definitely illustrates the dry end of the dry fall that we had and an early winter for a lot of areas. So we've seen 1 to even 3 class degradations across the Central Plains, touching most states, in fact, across the region. So generally areas of degradation over the last 6 months or 24 weeks. And then we've also seen some areas of improvement, say the southern portions of Missouri, western and northern Colorado, western Wyoming, as well as the northern portions of Wisconsin and into east central Minnesota, as well as some portions of Iowa, and then Illinois and into Indiana border. So we've certainly seen pockets where conditions have gotten better. So we do receive impact reports from around the region. So I appreciate all the reports that I've received from my colleagues around the country. So just, and this is not meant to be all inclusive, but these are just kind of some of the highlights of events and some impacts that have been reported. We did have a very significant snowfall event that impacted Nebraska and South Dakota. Over 2 feet of snow in mid-December for several areas of South Dakota. Unfortunately, on the Pine Ridge, that led to water restrictions due to restricts water access to water due to the snowfall. There were troubles getting to people, thousands trapped on the Pine Ridge Reservation, so very significant impacts here due to this storm in mid to late December. We did have a series of snow events that were developing impacts in Minnesota. There was the bomb cyclone felt in portions of Minnesota. So a bomb cyclone, technically, it's categorized when you have a 24 millibar reduction in pressure in the time span of 24 hours. So rapid intensification of a cyclone, that's what's considered a bomb cyclone. They've already had a season's worth of snowfall to date, so we are early in terms of where we are in the snowfall season, but already a season's worth. We've had some damage to natural and built infrastructure. You can see some trees that are bent over due to snow and heavy and wet snow. As well as degrading ice conditions. So we're hearing reports of unsafe ice conditions. And I did want to mention the Minnesota State Climatology Office. They put some nice information together in a blog form. So you see one of the headlines there. So I would encourage you, if you're from that area or curious about Minnesota weather and climate, certainly go on over to the State Climatology Office there and check out their blogs. There have been reported ice jams at various portions along the Missouri River. I'm highlighting one here. There's about a 20-mile long ice jam that is on the Nebraska-Iowa border there, of course. There was a power plant that had to close temporarily due to low water levels. So that is something that is being watched, certainly by the Omaha National Weather Service Office and others, as we look at risks and impacts throughout the course of the winter. So earlier I mentioned the relative warmth in the eastern part of this north central region. We have seen some recreational impacts in Wisconsin due to lack of snow across the south. So we're hearing that there's decent snow cover if you're in northern Wisconsin, but if you're in the south, not so much. Some hazardous ice fishing conditions, so unsafe conditions to be out on the ice. We've seen severe weather events this winter. We've had 2 confirmed tornadoes so far this year in Iowa and 8 tornadoes in Illinois. There's an image there is some tornado damage in McLean County, Illinois, courtesy of the National Weather Service. I think that was an EF1 tornado. So some severe weather, impacts that are occurring outside of what we would consider as a traditional severe weather season. Because of the dryness across areas of southern Kansas and elsewhere across the region, we have seen or heard reports of blowing soil, so soil that's being redistributed. All right, I'll transition now into the outlook portion of the webinar. So we'll start in the very short term and then extend out through the coming season. So this image, it's called a quantitative precipitation forecast. And we're looking at the time period January 19th through the 26th. It's not meant to be an exact amount necessarily for all this region, but if you see anything in the green color and those blue colors, there's decent chances for accumulating precipitation in those areas. It's been fairly wet recently, again, across that central portion of the region, but it looks like that area, say Nebraska, South Dakota, you see kind of that white area in the middle portion of the region, probably expected to be dry here in the coming 7 days, whereas probably see some precipitation there across Colorado in the east. The good thing is for southwest Kansas, might see some decent chances for precipitation. And then looking further east from Kentucky into Ohio and into Michigan and perhaps northern Wisconsin, we could see some precipitation. So again, don't take this as an exact amount but just an indication of where we might see some precipitation versus where the chances aren't as good. A short-term outlook, so this kind of 10 to 14-day time frame, so January 26th to February 1st. So thinking about the end of January. On the left, we see a lot of the country is encompassed in that blue color, which means that there is an increased or enhanced chance for below normal temperatures. So below what temperatures normally are for that end of January time period, which is about the coldest time of year, in fact, for this part of the country, is typically late January and early February. So the odds are tilted and favored for below normal temperatures. Looking at precipitation, portions of this region in that gray color there, in that image on the right, that's near normal, essentially. And where we see the green color, so there's the pockets in Montana, northern Wyoming, and western North and South Dakota, as well as southeast Colorado, Kansas, and then southern portions of the region, as well as northern Michigan and the UP of Michigan. We see a slight chance for above normal precipitation. Now, again, precipitation is typically pretty light in terms of a water equivalence this time of year, so it may not translate to a lot of precipitation. So thinking about that previous map where an increased chance for colder than normal conditions, one of the products that's put out by the Climate Prediction Center is a hazards risk. There is temperature, precipitation, as well as wind hazards that you can see in this prediction. And one of the things that I wanted to note is the slight to moderate risk of much below normal temperatures for the end of January. And by slight and moderate, we're looking at, say, a 20 to 40% chance. Once we get into that moderate or even high chance, then that's a pretty good indication that we'll have some much below normal temperatures. So the risk, again, of an Arctic air outbreak occurring the end of January and early February. All right, I'll switch to what's called ENSO status. ENSO stands for El Niño Southern Oscillation. So it's a pattern in the equatorial Pacific that does have an influence on the jet stream during the winter months. And if we think about typically what happens during a La Niña winter, that's currently what we're in, is a La Niña advisory. We're in our third consecutive winter of La Niña, which is not particularly common. It has happened before. I think there was 2 or 3 instances of three consecutive winter La Niñas. So it has happened before, but it's not particularly common to be in this La Niña pattern for 3 consecutive years. Currently, it is classified as a weak La Niña, but during the winter, we see pockets of enhanced wetness. So along the West Coast, particularly Northwest, as well as in the Ohio Valley, those 2 shaded green areas there, that's where we see an enhanced pattern of wetness. And no 2 La Niñas are alike, and they don't exactly always play out like this. And you can imagine if the jet stream, if that shifts north or south, or if the nature of it looks a little bit different, then how our weather patterns play out certainly can be different. But in general, this is how La Niña plays out, and we do see a cold pocket that influences especially north central portions of this region. All right, so given that we are in a La Niña, and I don't believe I highlighted on the previous slide that we are expected and indications are there particularly in the ocean, that we will transition to a neutral pattern. So neither La Niña or El Niño, but transition to a neutral pattern, and get out of the La Niña pattern that we see. And that's predicted to happen by springtime. What we're looking at here, just thinking about next month, so the February temperature and precipitation outlook. This is for the entire month, so we're going to vary from week to week on that weather time scale. But if we just look at the month as a whole for February, temperatures are leaning colder than normal in the central and northern portions of the region. So from Nebraska, catching a little bit of northwest Iowa and Minnesota and portions to the west, we're leaning toward a higher probability of below normal conditions. And notice for the east, so Ohio, Kentucky, portions of Indiana and Illinois, catching a little bit of Missouri, we are seeing a warm signal there. So we've had warmth recently, which I talked about earlier. For the month of February, we're leaning toward overall warmer than normal for the eastern portions of this region. It looks like we're going to continue kind of a wetness trend. So in the green coloration that you see there, so northern Wyoming into Montana, much of the Dakotas, Minnesota, and areas to the east, anything in that green color, we're looking like a tendency toward above normal precipitation conditions for the month of February. And I'll go a little bit further out here, looking at the February, March, and April time period. This looks similar to the previous map that I showed for the month of February. So extending out for the next 3 months, we see that persistence. We see a cold pocket in northern Wyoming, in Montana, in the Dakotas, and western Minnesota. Equal chances of above or below normal for a larger swath in the central portion of the region. And then kind of that continued warmth signal kind of edging in there, impacting far southern Illinois into Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky as well. Similarly, for precipitation, you can see the signal for this wet signal for the northwest and northern portions, as well as the Ohio Valley, that's looking like will trend toward potentially wetter than normal conditions. Now, as we start to get into March, April, and May in particular, that's when we tend to have our precipitation certainly ramps up climatologically. So we exit our drier time of year and enter kind of the more rainy time of year. So enhanced precipitation as we move toward our higher precipitation time of year. So now we start thinking of potentially some significant precipitation amounts. I also want to mention the dry pocket that we see in much of Colorado, western Kansas, and coming up into Nebraska. Unfortunately, that's an area that has been dry, especially southwest Nebraska and western Kansas. So that does not necessarily bode well for an alleviation or certainly removal of drought conditions for that portion of the region. So for kind of southern and south central plains, it's not looking great in terms of what our precipitation signal might be for that February to April timeframe. Okay, so the drought outlook, this came out several weeks ago. So the end of the year is when the Climate Prediction Center published this outlook, and I'll kind of walk through these colors with you. So the darker brown color that you see that covers all of Nebraska and areas further south, portions of southeast South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa, and that pocket, we're calling for drought persistence. So think of starting the growing season, in fact, in not much different conditions than where we are right now. So the way the U.S. Drought Monitor map looks, for that portion of the region, it's likely to be similar as we get into March and April. The yellow color there is indicating drought development is likely. So for south central Colorado, you see where it's colored in yellow there. So we're looking at potentially drought development in that area. And recall when I talked about the basin, currently snowpack in the basin that covers that area is trending below normal. Again, we've got some winter clearly left, so we'll see how that plays out. But for other portions of the region, anything in green there, we're looking at potentially drought removal. So portions of the Ohio Valley, the northern plains there, given how wet it's been and the likely persistence of wetness, we're looking at a removal of drought conditions. And anything in the tan, that light tan color, which you see in portions of Wyoming, Minnesota, North Dakota, and into Montana, that's where drought remains, but likely improves. So consider this an outlook and just guidance of thinking about how that U.S. Drought Monitor map might look by the end of March. So a summary of the outlook portion here. La Niña advisory is currently in effect, again, likely transition to neutral by spring. The northwest and eastern portions of the region are expecting to see wetter than normal conditions and potential for drought removal, as I just talked about. Dryness leads to likelihood of drought going into the 2023 growing season for Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. So certainly this is something that we'll be watching. Again, remember those soil profiles are they're quite dry as we entered the growing season. So we'll be watching kind of the patterns of storm events and springtime rainfall as we go forward. That warmer than normal conditions that we've had in the eastern portion of this region, those might, I could envision those continuing for the next several months, again, on an on-average basis. And if you were interested in hearing about a spring flood outlook, those are going to be conducted here in the coming weeks by River Forecast Center and National Weather Service offices. So that will be discussed in the next webinar. So look for that coming up. For additional information or expanding on things that I talked about, and for a recording of today's and past presentations, again, you can go to the High Plains Regional Climate Center website or the Midwestern Regional Climate Center website. There is quite a bit of information in various resources that are listed here. So there's drought.gov, there's the National Drought Mitigation Center, again, for that weekly drought monitor product or to look at changes over time. To get monthly climate reports and state of the climate information, you can go to NOAA and NCEI. You're welcome to visit various state climate offices and see what's available on their website or stateclimate.org, and then regional climate centers as well. And I will end the formal presentation there, and there's a list of individuals that you could reach out to for further information. We sit in various places and represent various agencies, but I would encourage you to reach out to us if you have more local questions or specific questions on drought or so forth. So I'll open up the floor, and there's several folks online that are joining me that could help answer questions as well.
Thank you, Martha. And I'm going to show an updated drought outlook from yesterday, or I mean, this morning. Hopefully, can you see that? What are you looking at?
Let's see. I might need to end.
Oh, wait. No, I think that's good. You can end yours, but I think I pulled up the more recent drought outlook that actually came out earlier today, and you might have not seen it, or sometimes your cache doesn't let you see these things. So anyway, here's the hopefully, Martha, you're seeing this. It's very similar to the last one that you showed, but it just has a few different areas of yellow where drought development may be likely. And as you can see in the south, to our south mainly, across Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado for that matter, it doesn't look like things are going to change too much according to predictions through the end of April. Okay. Thank you, Martha, very much for that. We had a number of questions about what normal is. So, Martha, do you want, I wrote some stuff in here talking about 30-year normals, and the latest 30-year normal that we use is 91 to 2020. But there are all kinds of normals depending upon your need. Do you want to say anything extra or more about that, Martha?
Yeah, good question. I guess it depends on kind of the metric that maybe the person was interested in. There are various places that you can get normals. I guess I would recommend NCEI. There's statewide. There is climate division normals. So there's different spatial scales at which you can look at these normals. I'm trying to look at the question here and I can't quite see it, but yeah, I guess I would say check out the NOAA NCEI information that's available to get specific normals for your location or region.
Yeah, and there's normals used. There's 15-year normals, there's 30 years. Some people want 5 and 10-year normals because they're very focused on the here and now as opposed to what happened in 1890 to 1920. So there's reason for wanting different normals for different uses. And so most of what Martha showed you, except for the rankings, the state rankings and all that business, were based on a 30-year normal. 30-year, and that being 1991 to 2020. And averaging all that out and comparing what's happening now to that. So as the Earth warms, of course, those normals become higher, and some people have questions about that. So, the other thing about El Nino, I had a couple questions about transitioning from one phase to another, and if that is a stair-step type of thing. Is it abrupt? Is it a steady slide? My quick answer to that is every year is a little different, although there is almost always a lag between what the ocean does and what the atmosphere does. So it may take a couple months even for the for the atmosphere to reflect the new phase that it's in. So the fact that we're saying, okay, well, in March or April, we're going to be in a neutral phase. Well, the atmosphere doesn't care what we say. It may continue on in sort of a La Nina pattern through that period. So that's why you see some of these forecasts that are very La Nina-esque. I'll just put it that way. The other thing we always say in all these things is, no matter if it's El Nino, La Nina, or neutral, chaos reigns, and La Nina or ENSO, El Nino, sometimes explains only 10 to 20% of what we know. There's a lot of other things going on that can mess up our forecasts, especially these longer lead forecasts. I don't know, Dennis, I know you're on also from USDA. Did you want to say something about any of those topics so far?
Yeah, just to touch on La Nina a little bit. I think it's good to remind people that we use is it a 3-month, Doug, that we look at it month by month over a 3-month period. So we can start getting out of La Nina conditions, but not officially be out of La Nina because of how we calculate it and the data that we use to calculate it.
Yeah, officially it's 5 consecutive 3-month periods. Okay. Okay, here's one I haven't seen. Let's see. Ryan San Diego asked this question in mid-December. Model showing a blocking high over Eastern Pacific. Then suddenly the high collapsed completely, leading to it. Yes, we didn't talk too much about this, but we could a little bit. Being in the center of the country, we don't get whapped like the West Coast does when the Pineapple Express is underway. And so water temperature is broken down, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have the attribution. I don't have the attribution of why things, if you will, the blocking pattern broke down, the high broke down, and we got that train of low pressure systems or storm systems into the West Coast. It really was a train, and it really was well connected. So there will be some studies, I'm positive, on why that happened and how that happened. But it's, I would say, yes, it's not as common. It's not that common, except we've seen it happen before. And thus we know about atmospheric rivers and what they can do. And maybe this one was a little different because of how long it lasted. But again, I don't have an expertise in that either. Martha or Dennis might want to say something. However, what I will also add, though, is that you could see the storm track once it made it through all the mountains, what happened once it got out into the plains. Some place in the plains got quite a bit of snow because those pretty intense low pressure systems were able to draw up moisture from the Gulf and other places, and were pretty strong. So any comments, Dennis or Martha, on the West Coast and Pacific in general and what happened?
I don't have anything additional, Doug.
Okay.
That is one thing doing talks around during farm season here. It's been coming up. It's, what does that mean? What has happened in the West Coast mean for what's happening in the Midwest? And I think you touched on it, Doug, that there's, more storm systems that come across. They need to tap into additional moisture, but that's about all we can say as to what that means for California versus us.
Yeah, the other thing I guess we can add to this is that remember the warmth that we just saw, mostly, I'll say east of the Mississippi, east of the Missouri River, in terms of just really warm early January. That is sort of in response to sort of low pressure to the west. So we have a high to the east, low pressure sort of generally in the western U.S. And that's what we get. We get sort of this train of snow and rain, sort of tracking from Colorado northeast, somewhere across the plains, and places like southern Wisconsin not getting a lot of snow, northern Wisconsin getting really dumped on. So we're seeing places that have gotten a lot more than normal to this point in the season, and a lot of places sort of east and a little bit south with virtually nothing and very, very warm temperatures. Okay, transition out of La Nina due chances of extreme precipitation in spring and summer increase. I'm going to say I don't know, and if anybody else wants to talk about that, feel free. I wouldn't say necessarily.
It's interesting because I've had some problems looking for this. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has some graphics that show what happens during La Niñas and El Niños, how the patterns shift. But there aren't any that look at, okay, we're going to look at neutral only. We're going to ignore the extreme, the two sides of it and look at neutral. So that would be interesting to get some graphics and do some analysis on what does neutral look like.
Yeah. So what we can base maybe not extreme precipitation forecasts, but general forecasts. And we've said this also before, is trend. There's a trend out there. Temperatures ease relatively easy in terms of trend. Precipitation is a different beast altogether, because there can be 10 and 20 and even 30-year cycles with precipitation that can mislead us into thinking it's going and continuing to be one way or another for a long time, and it can shift. Okay, next one we're going to focus on is 2/3 of the Earth's land now under threat to go dry. Yep, there is definitely a potential for aridification in portions of. We're going to talk about that more. You're going to hear more and more about aridification, places just becoming more arid, maybe because of climate change and in other factors that lead to it. And yes, I'm very honest about the chaos that I definitely don't know what I don't know. Thank you, David. Any other comments or questions anybody has, or before we wrap this up? It's a little after 2. In that case, I will say thank you very much, everybody. Martha, you especially, and then Dennis for getting on too and supporting the cast of characters here. We'll see you all in February, where Becky Bollinger from Colorado will, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about snow. Anyway, Colorado will give the presentation. So thank you very much. We appreciate you coming and your attendance.